Hi guys, Steven Central here and welcome back to another video. And today we are going to be looking at a topic that I've touched on a couple of times before, and I thought I'd elaborate on it further. Now, with a couple of my videos, I've kind of briefly touched on this topic. So, mainly the Five Doctors. When I looked at the Five Doctors quickly in my review, and when I ranked the Cyberman stories, also a little bit further back when I did my Colin Baker's tier list, I mentioned the two Doctors, and so today I thought I'd look quickly on both classic stories and new stories, and do the multi-Doctor stories work as a celebration concept and also just a concept story in general. So, for some background history, basically, back in 1973, it was coming up to Doctor Who's 10th anniversary. Obviously, 3 people had played the Doctor at that point: Hartnell, Troughton, and Pertwee, who was the current Doctor. And the writers and producer, so Barry Letts and the director and all that, they had an idea. So Bob Baker and Dave Martin pitched this script of the 3 Doctors, which was a story where the first 3 incarnations of the Doctor would meet up and battle some evil, which they end up fighting Omega in the script. I believe originally the first Doctor was supposed to appear more heavily, but William Hartnell had some declining health, and those issues led for him to literally not appear in this literally not at all. So he does become more of a backbencher to Hartnell, to Patrick Troughton and John Pertwee's Doctors for most of the episode. Story also introduced Omega and gave Pertwee his ability to the TARDIS to fly around the universe in the TARDIS again. For this story, it was a pretty good story. I think the concept here was pretty smart. I enjoy this story quite a lot. I think Pertwee and Troughton's chemistry in this story has a really good sense. It's got a really good sense of it, and I think that's probably the best part of the story, because season 10 is probably my favourite classic season, possibly maybe only battling season 12, because I don't think there's a bad story in season 10, but I think this one works because maybe it's not the best story in season 10. I think the Green Death or Frontier in Space possibly are more preferred for me, but I think Troughton and Pertwee's charisma and relationship in this story definitely elevates this. And at first you might go, oh well, they're just on screen and maybe they're fun together, but I mean, it's still a good story, and which is not wrong, but it's kind of, you need to look at it more from especially, I think this idea of Pertwee and Troughton's chemistry being really good is big in this story, but I think that it gets amplified in multitudes when you consider that 10 years later, John Nathan Turner would try and follow the same script or the same way as Barry Letts did with the 5 Doctors. Now, in fairness, I've talked about the 5 Doctors a lot, and I think it's, as I've probably said a couple of times, it's not my favourite story. I think for what it is, it's quite a good story, but it's not an amazing story. It had a couple of issues behind the scene set, and it's not amazing. But the reason I bring it up is because this is an issue with this the 5 Doctors, which I think arguably this story probably does the worst, and 2 Doctors probably kind of does this a little bit, but it's more egregious in the 5 Doctors, where the Doctors don't interact. The 4th Doctor's not in this at all, pretty much. The 1st Doctor, who Richard Turndale plays, and Pete Davidson's Doctor appear on screen together for a couple of scenes in the TARDIS, but then Davison leaves, and Hurndall's by himself, and he goes off and does his own thing. Troughton and Pertwee don't get to meet any of their Doctors until they get into Rassilon's Tower, and it's funny because they seem to immediately have chemistry again. Just so you question, why didn't John Nathan Turner or the director of the episode not put them near each other and maybe they could meet up? I think it just doesn't really make sense to me. And also, it wouldn't be strange because Pertwee's met the Brigadier who Troughton was with, and the Brigadier knows who Sarah Jane is, I assume, so it would have worked quite well. Then we've got the two Doctors next, and this one, again, this is possibly where in the classic run they're starting to kind of slow down a little bit, because this, unlike the other two previous stories, wasn't an anniversary. Troughton returned because Robert Holmes and John Nathan Turner said, "Do you want to come back?" And Patrick Troughton was like, "Well, I had fun with 5 Doctors, so yeah, sure, I'll come back." And again, this is another one of... I think this one, as I said, does the same as the 5 Doctors, where it's pretty poor, but it's not awful. Like, the Doctors are not in it much, and that's the issue. They're both the Doctors get screen time. It's not like a show where you've tried to make it so there's 2 main characters and they don't get enough screen time, or there's 2 main plot threads and they're not getting enough screen time, so one feels slightly underdeveloped. This is just the Doctors what should meet earlier. I believe this is 3 parts, but because this is the 45-minute format, that's 6-part story, and I believe, if memory serves, that Troughton doesn't appear... he appears in the beginning, and then he doesn't appear for like as officially as properly as the Doctor until maybe the end, maybe partway through part 3. So although you're stuck with Colin, which is not a bad thing, it's like with possibly like Jon Pertwee's story. Jon Pertwee obviously appears in the 3 Doctors, but he does it with Patrick Troughton, so it feels like Patrick Troughton's getting his screen time, whether you're not overshadowing Pertwee. 5 Doctors, they all seem to like divvy it out, so although the 5 Doctors is like 45 minutes shorter, it does kind of work as a, whole thing. Now, that's just the classic run. The classic run happened to have 3 of these, and yeah, they're all, maybe not all too amazing, they're probably just all quite a variable degree of success, I'd say. But then we get into the new series. Now, obviously, the new series had been going for a little while by the time the 50th anniversary came about, which was in 2013, and obviously we got the stunning Day of the Doctor, which saw Matt Smith in it as the Doctor, and David Tennant return, with John Hurt being introduced as I want to say filler Doctor, because he was kind of a filler Doctor, because Eccleston wouldn't return to play the role, and for some reason, whatever reason, Stephen Moffat didn't think to bring Paul McGann back, which I think maybe would have been quite cool to see McGann come back, but I don't know if he could or if he couldn't. But he was in the 5-ish Doctors, so it would have been... So I assume he probably could have done it if Moffat had asked. But this story is a strange one. I do like this one. I think the Day of the Doctor is similar to the 3 Doctors, because the story is completely different, but the way he set it out is the same. In the 3 Doctors, we follow Pertwee from like the beginning chunk, and then we meet Troughton kind of comes in, and then Hartnell just kind of comes in every so often. In this, it's kind of similar. So we're with Matt Smith for most of it, for the beginning 10-20 minutes, and then we kind of see David Tennant and what he's been doing for those kind of 5-10 minutes, and then they meet each other, and then a bit later on, maybe about another 4 or 5 minutes later, then we see what John Hurt's been doing, and he comes in, and I like that. I think it makes sense because not only do you then first of all establish Matt Smith is the main Doctor in this, second of all, David Tennant gets a pretty decent amount of screen time, and they work pretty well together. And third of all, they've not separated all the Doctors, because I think, apart from maybe the first 20-30 minutes of this story, okay, I'm probably exaggerating, it's probably like 20 minutes of it, they're not together, but then they're together for the next 45 minutes of the story, so it's not like the Five Doctors where they're in it for like the next 10 minutes and then that's the end of it. They are in it for a significant period of time, so which works in my opinion. Yeah, I think this one's a good story. I think it's better because I think the Two Doctors is that point where people are getting tired of these multi-Doctor stories, because they were like, well, you've done this one and you've done this one, and Charlton's appeared a couple of times and it's just maybe not as interesting anymore. But this, because it'd been so long since the classic run and stuff, a multi-Doctor story was quite an interesting idea, because maybe some people hadn't watched classic, had not seen one before and thought, wow, this is a cool concept. But then you get to what I call the, well, I don't know, but like the overabundance or the over-reliance on multi-Doctor stories, because then, similar to the Two Doctors, you have Twice Upon a Time, which I think works in a sense, because both David Bradley, who's taking on Hartnell's character of the first Doctor, and Peter Capaldi are in it together from the get-go, which means that they're not separated for any length of time or any period of time. They're always together. I mean, even if they're not on the same screen, they're near enough to each other. But then we got Futures of the Doctor, and this is the point where I'm kind of going, oh, for God's sake, can we not have any more multi-Doctor stories? Because we had Twice Upon a Time, which was good, but it was about 4 or 5 years, so there was a bit of a gap. But then 3 years later, we then get a multi-Doctor story with Whittaker, and it was awful, to say the least, because the Doctors weren't together. I mean, it was. The thing is, I don't really want to call it a multi-Doctor story because it's not the best multi-Doctor story, because the Doctor's not in it for Whittaker's in it, but Joe Martin's Doctor's not in it for most of the story. Then there's obviously the reveal of the 60th anniversary coming up, because that's coming in like 2 years, and people are going, well, is Chris Chibnall going to bring these Doctors back and these Doctors back from a Doctor story? And I just want to pose, well, I've looked all of them so far, all the ones we've got so far. I mean, if you're not counting Dimensions in Time, but really, who is? They're not. It's not a good concept. I think that maybe I think if they'd cut down the 3 Doctors, a good idea. I think if the 5 Doctors was better, if the 5 Doctors hadn't had so many issues with it, maybe then that would have been fine. But I think it was lost when the 2 Doctors and Twice Upon a Time and Futures of the Doctor made it so that it wasn't an anniversary story anymore. Because the reason people look forward to them was, well, the 3 Doctors and the 5 Doctors had a gap of 10 years. And people were going, well, that's fair enough, 10 years, you're going to have to celebrate that. And in the 25th anniversary, Sylvester McCoy didn't get a multi-Doctor story, which again shows you how how it kind of was realised it was going to go and go, well, it's not that interesting anymore. I think if I was to do the 60th, I would not do a multi-Doctor story, mainly because, although yes, it would be nice to see Matt Smith return and Capaldi return, or David Tennant return, possibly. Even if Christopher Eccleston return would be really cool. But I think the issue is that the multi-Doctor stories in the 70s and the earlier 80s were like, wow, this is a celebration of Doctor Who for an anniversary, and it was the celebration of Doctor Who, and that's what that episode was about, being celebrating Doctor Who. We're bringing back returning characters a little bit. But when you make it a standard story. So when you make it mid-season 22, you've got a multi-Doctor story, or mid-season 12, or mid-season or Christmas special for season 10. It does lose its charm that it once had, and I think that's the issue with these, and I think that's why Doctor Who should probably try and branch out a little bit, because the multi-Doctor stories are obviously easy concept to go to. For an anniversary story, you're obviously thinking, well, they've always done a multi-Doctor story, so why shouldn't we just do a multi-Doctor story? But I think it would be nice to maybe either do a crossover, try and see if they can do something with either another property that BBC own, which is a sci-fi one. I don't know if they could do something with Red Dwarf, which would be quite funny, or something with Star Trek, something like still sci-fi, but with another franchise that's established, or possibly B, just make it a story where it's more of a if you're going to do a multi-Doctor story, make it a celebration, because you need to first, I think, as that, you need to make it so the multi-Doctor stories are only celebratory stories. You don't chuck a multi-Doctor story in for any reason other than it to be a anniversary story. But yeah, that's just my opinion on the anniversary, the multi-Doctor stories. Overall, they're quite good. I mean, it is quite fun to watch your favourite Doctors on screen together, but I think that the writers of Doctor Who need to really maybe look at them and think, well, if we're going to do it again, should we maybe make it more of a celebration rather than it just being another story? But yeah, if you have enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and watch another one. But yeah, see you.